This evening is special. It's the first in a Global Perspectives series, where leading international figures, in particular corresponding fellows of the British Academy, and Noam Chomsky is a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, talk about issues of global interest and concern. To those of you who were at university in the 60s and 70s, Noam will be a total hero. And it's a great pleasure, Noam, for us to be with you tonight. You honour us with your presence. Not only transforming a subject, very few of us are blessed with that, but as someone who bore witness to human values and to political protest, you are special to us, and you are special to us in that sense. So it's a great privilege to have you with us. I'm just here to introduce Lord Melvyn Bragg is the host chair of the evening. It's a great pleasure for us to have you with us. Again, Melvyn, you do so much for us and with us. Melvyn, honorary fellow, so you have an honorary fellow of the British Academy and you have a corresponding fellow of the British Academy on the platform. Melvyn is one of the leading writers and broadcasters of our time. And because he's so well known and recognisable, I'll stop there, Melvyn. Thank you both so much for coming. And thank you again, Noam. It's a privilege to be in your company. Thank you.
Have about 2 minutes. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. And welcome to everyone to this evening. We're here to listen to and be in the company of Noam Chomsky. As Nick has rightly said, a hero in succeeding decades. So it's rather a nervous introduction I'm going to give, but I'm not going to stint because I would like to say 2 or 3 things about our speaker. First of all, to outline the agenda of the evening, Professor Chomsky will talk for 20 to 30 minutes about his work on language and related matters. Then he's asked me to talk to him for a while, maybe 10, 15 minutes, something like that, on his political activism and his early experiences leading to that major preoccupation. And then it'll be thrown open to the audience. There should be upwards of an hour for questions from the audience. So that's what we hope to do. Professor Chomsky has numerous honorary degrees from major universities, as well as being a fellow of several professional associations in the USA, the UK, and elsewhere, and a multiple prize winner. Paul Robinson in the New York Times book review wrote, "Judged in terms of the power, range, novelty, and influence of his thought, Noam Chomsky is arguably the most important intellectual alive today." Also, he was cited in the field of arts and humanities more often than any other living scholar between 1980 and 1992. His work has influenced many fields, including artificial intelligence, cognitive science, computer science, logic, mathematics, music theory, programming language theory, and psychology. And he's also well known for his pursuit of his political agenda, which very crudely could be described based on syndicalism and libertarian socialism. He's currently Professor Emeritus at the MIT Institute of Technology. His father was a Ukrainian Ashkenazi Jew who fled to the USA in 1913 and became a considerable Hebrew scholar. His mother, from Belarus, also taught Hebrew language and classes. So, for many, many reasons, we're delighted that you're with us this evening, and we look forward to your talk. Professor Chomsky. Thank you.
I'd like to sketch a program for the study of language that I've been trying to follow for almost 70 years, coming to understand the nature of the program more clearly as the years proceed and as results and problems accrue. And of course, learning a great deal from the contributions of many others, including many students who've joined along the way. I should make clear that what I'm going to describe is far from being a consensus in the various fields in which the program belongs. That includes linguistics, cognitive science, philosophy, and human biology, where it is closer to a consensus. Nevertheless, I think it's well-founded, and I'll try to briefly convince you of why I think it's reasonable to take that view. The program is based on a few fundamental assumptions which have always seemed to me to be truisms, though they're highly contested, which opens an obvious question for you to consider, a problem for you to solve. The first of these assumptions is that the many varied approaches to language all presuppose, at least tacitly, in fact, even when they deny it, presuppose a concept, a particular concept of language, sometimes called internal language, I language for short. That is the assumption that each of us has acquired and mastered and internalized an internal system, mostly in the brain, that enters into our use of language. I can't think of a coherent alternative, but as I say, it's contested. Second assumption is that each I language incorporates a basic principle, namely that it yields an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions, each of which has two kinds of interpretation. One, an interpretation at the sensory motor level for externalization in one or another modality, usually articulatory and auditory, though that's not necessary. And secondly, with a conceptual system that's involved in inference, interpretation, planning, organization of action, and the other elements of what is loosely falls under what we call thought. So that means that I language is an audible system of audible signs for thought. It's quoting the great Indo-Europeanist William Dwight Whitney a century ago. Not necessarily audible, but I'll keep to that. In recent years, the general theory of I language has come to be called universal grammar. That's adapting a traditional concept to a new context. Universal grammar for short, UG. UG therefore seeks to determine the possible computational procedures that satisfy the basic principle, and also the atomic elements that enter into the computations. Any computational system is going to have some system of minimal elements, atomic elements. These atomic elements pose some real mysteries, deep mysteries. The minimal meaning-bearing elements of human language, more or less like words, but not actually words, they are radically different from anything known in animal communication systems. There's a total discontinuity there. And the origin of these elements is entirely unknown. There are no ideas about it, partly because their nature has not been adequately recognized. There are insights about these elements right through the history of philosophy, going back to the pre-Socratics and the great periods of 17th, 18th century philosophy, mostly forgotten, somewhat explored, but insufficiently. It's a major open topic for investigation. When they're carefully examined, these minimal elements, they show that widely adopted doctrines about their nature are untenable, That includes the prevailing referentialist doctrine, as it's called, which holds that words pick out extramental entities. It's a doctrine which is illustrated in the titles of more or less of standard works, titles like Words and Things or Word and Object. Those in the field will recognize the books. First of all, they're not words, so they're word-like, and secondly, they're not objects in the sense of something mentally, physically identifiable independently of the nature of the mind. It's a very serious problem. There's a lot to say about this, but I'll put that aside for now. Well, that's the first component of UG. The second component is the theory of computational procedures, usually called generative procedures. That topic has been amenable to study since the mid-20th century, really, for the first time, based on the work of Turing, Gödel, Church, and others, which established the general theory of computation on quite firm grounds, making it possible to ask questions about particular kinds of generative procedures, namely those that satisfy the conditions for human language. And these generative procedures must satisfy a number of general conditions and many specific empirical ones. One general condition is that they have to be learnable. We do acquire the languages that we've mastered. A second condition that they have to meet is that they have to be evolvable. There must be some way in which they evolved, since they have evolved. When you think about acquisition of an I language, it's based on two kinds of conditions. One is the genetic constitution that it turns out to be a shared human property. There's no detectable difference across the human species in capacity to acquire a language. There are, of course, some individual differences, but no known group differences. So there is a universal genetic capacity, that's UG, the genetic constraints of UG. And the second, there are language-independent principles of acquisition. Now, it's been well established that language capacity is quite radically dissociated from other cognitive capacities. That fact, along with close examination of the properties of languages, leads us to expect that the second factor, language-independent principles, probably consists substantially of organism-independent principles, not other cognitive processes. There are some, but mainly it seems to be general principles independent of organisms, maybe basically laws of nature. Since we're considering a computational system, we would anticipate that these include the principles of computational efficiency that fall under natural law. They're not specific to language or to organisms. I'll say a few things about this expectation. Well, clearly, the more complex our assumptions are about the nature of UG, the greater is the burden on an evolutionary account. So that's problematic. For that reason, along with general considerations of rational inquiries, so-called scientific method, research into UG from the beginning, roughly 60, 70 years ago, has sought to reduce a postulated complexity of UG. Now, the optimal solution would be that UG reduces to the simplest possible computational principles. They would then function in terms of principles of computational efficiency, which are essentially natural law. That's the optimal situation. It's been called the strong minimalist thesis, SMT for short. Some years ago, SMT seemed a very exotic idea. In fact, so exotic it wasn't formulated. But in recent years, evidence has been accumulating suggesting that something like that might be not far from true. That would be a surprising discovery. It would have far-reaching import if it can be established, and I think there's been notable progress towards establishing it. It would mean, in effect, that language is kind of a perfect system at its core. The apparent complexity and diversity would be kind of around the periphery, not part of the basic nature of the system of language that all of us have internalized. Well, let's ask what kinds of conclusions about language would hold if SMT is correct. Every computational system has embedded in it an operation which takes two objects, call them X and Y, and forms from them some new object, call it Z. That's the nature of computation. So call that operation merge. According to SMT, merge ought to be as simple as possible. That means that in forming Z from X and Y won't be modified. They'll stay the same, they won't change. And furthermore, no, they won't be arranged in any way, so they won't be ordered. They'll just be an unordered pair, X and Y. That means, if you think it through, that merge just reduces to set formation. A merge of X and Y forms the set containing X and Y. By logic alone, there are two possible kinds of merge. X and Y might be distinct from one another. So for example, when the element when you take, say, read and books, actually the elements underlying them, and put them together to get read books, that's one kind of merge. They're distinct elements. And merge will form the set, including read and books. The other possibility is that one is part of the other. It's the only logical possibility. So for example, suppose you take the sentence, actually what underlies the sentence, not the actual sentence. Will he read which books? Take that sentence and merge it with which books, which is part of that sentence. You get which books will he read, which books. That actually comes out in spoken language as which books will he read, for reasons that I'll return to in a moment. But when you take a piece of will he read which books, and you add which books to it, it comes out which books will he read which books. Drop the last which books will he read. That is an example of a ubiquitous phenomenon of language, which has been rather puzzling for a long time. It's called displacement. Phrases are pronounced in one position, but they're interpreted both there and in another position. It's a ubiquitous property of the languages of the world. It was long supposed that this is a kind of a strange imperfection of languages. And in fact, some of the standard theories don't permit it, because it seems a very odd phenomenon, though of course it's universal in language. Turns out it's an automatic consequence of the simplest possible language. One of the two logical possibilities for the simplest computational operation, merge, is that one of the two merged things is part of the other. Stick it together, that's what you get. Well, that's displacement. Notice that in accordance with SMT, the merge of will he read which books and which books yields which books will he read which books. Now that's not what we pronounce. What we pronounce is which books will he read, deleting the second occurrence of which books. There's a reason for that. That's forced by computational efficiency. To repeat the two would impose a very considerable computational burden. In fact, for normal sentences, it becomes extremely complex. So we simply don't articulate it. We articulate only the most prominent occurrence. This kind of copy property of displacement. It turns out to be extremely significant for semantic interpretation. It determines how sentences are in fact interpreted. So when you hear the sentence, "Which books will he read?" you understand it to mean something like, "For which books X, he will read those books X," interpreting which books in two positions. That's ubiquitous throughout language in all kinds of constructions. There's no time to go into it now, but it turns out that quite complex properties of sentence interpretation fall out at once automatically just from these optimal assumptions about how computation takes place. Use the simplest possible computational operation, reduce computational complexity by not articulating the copies that automatically appear. That happens to give rich semantic interpretation, but on the other hand, it does cause problems for understanding. So, well, before going into that, let me just give you one other example to illustrate the kind of phenomenon that takes place. So take the sentence, "The boys expect to meet each other." It means something like, each of the boys expects to meet the other boys. Each of the boys expect to meet each other. Now suppose you embed that sentence in the context, "I wonder who." So you get, "I wonder who the boys expect to meet each other." If you think about that, what that means, it doesn't mean that the boys are going to meet each other. Each other has nothing to do with the boys in that sentence. Rather, the phrase "each other" does not refer to the boys, it refers to the more remote element who, not the proximal element, the boys. So why does that happen? The reason is that for the mind, though not for the ear, the proximal element really is who, because of the copy property of movement. Who has moved from the place where you don't hear it to the front, but remains because copies aren't changed, and that's what the mind hears. It's not what the ear hears. So that's how you get the interpretation. Innumerable examples like this. Notice that if both copies were pronounced, that is, if you said, "I wonder who the boys expect who to meet each other," if both copies were pronounced, that would make perception much easier. In fact, one of the main problems of the theory of perception and programs, automated programs of machine interpretation, so-called parsing, one of the problems is, the main problem is to find the unpronounced gaps. It's called filler gap problems. You hear a word like "which books," and you got to find some place where it isn't pronounced in the sentence in order to interpret it. Turns out to be quite a hard problem. That problem would be overcome if, in fact, you just pronounced all the copies. So if you think this, and again, there is a good reason why you don't, a good computational reason why you don't pronounce the copies. It reduces computational complexity quite considerably, in fact, enormously in normal sentences. So what we have is a conflict between computational efficiency and efficiency of use. If we keep the computational efficiency, we get the right interpretations, but use of language is inefficient and difficult. That includes communication as a special case. So we have a conflict between computational efficiency and communicative efficiency. In this case, and in fact in all such cases, there are many, communicative efficiency is sacrificed. Computational efficiency wins hands down. That tells us something. It tells us that contrary to current virtual dogmas, the language is not at root an instrument of communication. It's not well designed for communication. It's an instrument of thought. It's very well designed for thought, not well designed for communication. There are many other examples of that. And that is an interesting result itself, that It means that language is basically a system of meaning, of mental processes. It's used various ways, including communication, but not very well. There is a modern dogma, and the word dogma is not an exaggeration in philosophy and psychology, linguistics, that somehow what's called the function of language is communication. Now, that dogma does not survive inspection. As soon as you look at even simple properties of language like this, you see that communicative efficiency is sacrificed and computational efficiency is preserved, and out of that comes the right semantic interpretations of sentences, but difficulty for the user, and the difficulty can be quite severe. That's, as I said, for theory of perception, machine parsing programs, these are the major difficulties. The conclusion, I think, that follows is that in a fundamental way, language really is a system of signs for thought, much as Whitney described, which actually is a traditional view of Locke and many others, different from the modern conception, modern dogma, that language is a system whose function is communication. I suspect that the modern view is a kind of a reflection of the behaviorist tendency in modern thought, which is quite pervasive and I think quite in error. Well, there is substantial further evidence for this conclusion. So notice again that the optimal computational operation, what I call merge, imposes no order on the merged elements. So when you merge read and books, there's no order. Equivalently, read books and books read. It follows then that the mental operations involving language are independent of order. And in fact, that turns out to be true. So whether a language has read books or books read, it gives exactly the same semantic interpretation. Languages vary in which they use. We do have to order words in order to speak, but that's a property of the sensory motor system. We can't speak in parallel. We can't speak structures. Sensory motor system, the auditory and articulatory system, impose a kind of a filter. They require that whatever's going on in our minds is going to have to come out as a row of beads in a string. But that's just a property of the sensory motor system, which has nothing to do with language. In fact, if you look at the evolution of humans, the sensory motor system was in place long before language emerged, long before there's any evidence that language existed. And in fact, it goes back to other primates. Apes, for example, have almost the same auditory system as humans, but if, say, an ape is presented with linguistic productions, all it'll hear is noise, hears nothing. On the other hand, a newborn infant instantly extracts language-relevant data from the noise that's around it, which is a pretty astonishing achievement. But it happens universally for newborn infants. Apes hearing the same thing, just hear noise, even though they have the same auditory system. And the same is true of production. These are distinctive human properties, and they're basically in the mind. The sensory motor system is, of course, used, but it's ancillary, secondary. Whatever's going on, it's much more deeply embedded in the brain. Well, these observations have other empirical consequences. So take another simple sentence. Take the sentence, birds that fly instinctively swim. Notice it's ambiguous. It could be instinctively, it could be that they're flying instinctively or that they're instinctively swimming. The birds that fly instinctively swim, ambiguous. Take the adverb instinctively, take it out of the sentence, put it in front, and form instinctively birds that fly swim. Okay? Now it's unambiguous. Instinctively doesn't go with fly. It only goes with swim. If it's in the middle, it goes with either. But instinctively, birds that fly swim means they instinctively swim, not they instinctively fly. The adverb is connected only with the remote verb, swim, not with the proximal verb fly. That's a rather puzzling phenomenon when you think about it. It's a puzzle that was noticed for the first time about 60 years ago, when the first efforts were made to try to construct explicit generative accounts of language, when you didn't try to construct explicit theories, just didn't notice it. This is typical of the history of science, incidentally. So if you go back to, say, the 1600, there were answers, well-established answers to many questions. They've been accepted for millennia, in fact. So, for example, if I'm holding this and it's got the boiling water inside, and I take my hand off, and if I let it go, the cup will fall and the steam will rise. Why? There was an answer. They're each going to their natural place. End of story. That's the answer that was accepted by leading scientists for thousands of years. When Galileo and his contemporaries permitted themselves to be puzzled about this, modern science begins. And it turns out all your intuitions are wrong about rate of fall and just about everything else. Ability to be puzzled is just the beginning of serious inquiry. And this is a good example. This is a real puzzle. Why should the adverb go with the remote verb and not the proximal verb? If you think about simplicity of designing, say, a mechanical program for interpretation, should be the other way around. Close distance is easy to compute. What's actually used, which happens to be structural distance, is quite difficult to compute. And nevertheless, languages universally use structural distance, never proximal distance. Children understand this automatically without any evidence. And so, for example, in a case like this that I just mentioned, the evidence available to the child is actually zero. There's no empirical evidence for this property in cases like the kind I mentioned. And yet, as early as it's possible to test children, which is about 3 years old, they never make mistakes. They understand it perfectly, which means that they are using reflexively the complex property of structural proximity and not the simple property of linear proximity. There have been many attempts in the computational literature to try to explain this on the basis of inspection of data, massive statistical analysis of big data, and so on and so forth. All fail completely, irremediably, and it's obvious why. In cases of this kind, the child has no evidence at all to show that the simple property of linear distance must be ignored in favor of the complex property of structural distance. And as I said, experiment shows that children understand this unerringly as soon as they can be tested, never make errors. Of course, they're not instructed. All of this follows at once if we assume that SMT is correct and that the computations of language are as simple as possible, part of our innate endowment, and therefore do not impose order. Order is just a peripheral phenomenon, a reflex of properties of the sensory motor system that have nothing to do with language at all. Well, there is both neurological and evolutionary evidence to support the conclusion that language is computationally efficient in this sense and well designed for thought, though difficult for use and for communication. So one striking set of experiments conducted in Milan by a combination of neurologists and linguists showed that nonsense systems, invented nonsense systems that keep to UG principles elicit normal activation in the language areas of the brain. But much simpler systems that use order in violation of linear order, in violation of UG, yield diffuse activation in the brain, which means that the subjects are treating them as a puzzle, not as a language. And of course, as a puzzle, you can solve it. There is confirming evidence by Neil Smith and his associates who were working with a cognitively deficient but linguistically gifted subject and with normals, interesting extensions of this work. Well, the very if we look at evolution of language, we actually have very limited evidence about it. It's kind of a surprising fact that in the last roughly 20 years, there's a burgeoning literature, huge growing literature about evolution of language based on almost no evidence. In my view, almost totally vacuous, but I won't go into that. We have two facts, really, about evolution of human language. The rest is fairy tales. You can make them up at will. One fact, and it's pretty firmly established, is that for the last roughly 50,000 years, maybe a little more, there's no evolution of language at all. The evidence for that, that's roughly the time when our ancestors left Africa. Small numbers of them left Africa, spread around the world. You can argue about the numbers, but it's roughly 50,000 years. The evidence for that is say if you take a child from an Amazonian tribe or a tribe in Papua New Guinea, which may not have had contact with other humans for 40,000 years, and the child is brought up here, it'll speak perfect British English, and conversely. As I mentioned, there is no evidence for any group difference in language capacity, which means there's been no evolution of language capacity for roughly that time, 50,000 years. It's not too surprising. It's a short period from an evolutionary point of view. The second fact, which is plausible, though harder to establish, is that if you go back shortly before that, maybe another 50,000 years, there's no evidence at all for any kind of symbolic behavior. Here we're looking at archaeological evidence. Don't have tape recordings, of course. But if you look at the pretty rich archaeological evidence, it appears that roughly in that extremely small period, it's a flick of an eye in evolutionary time, say maybe 50,000 years or less, somewhere in that period, you suddenly get a rich explosion of complex behavior, complex tool making instead of rigid tool making associated with earlier hominids, complex social behavior, complex family structures evident from the archaeological evidence, lots of symbolic behavior of all kinds. It appears kind of suddenly, sometimes called by paleoanthropologists a great leap forward, and roughly around 75,000 years ago, plus or minus. And it's generally assumed plausibly that that's connected to the emergence of language. It's hard to imagine any of this activity without language. And so we have good reason to believe that language emerged very suddenly from an evolutionary point of view, and after that hasn't changed. It just stayed the way it was. Well, that's what the few facts suggest, and it suggests that at its core, the language capacity must be very simple in accordance with SMT, this strong minimalist hypothesis. It's also worth noting that the apparent variety and complexity of language, and also the susceptibility of language to change, which is very great, lies almost entirely in the process of externalization to the sensory motor system, not in the core internal systems of syntactic organization and semantic interpretation. The systems that generate the underlying expressions and provide them to the conceptual system, they don't seem to change. They seem to be virtually uniform among languages, which would not be surprising because the child, in fact, hears almost no evidence about them, as in the cases I mentioned. And the facts become much more dramatic when you turn to examples of normal complexity. So to summarize briefly, the optimal conclusion about the nature of language would be that its basic principles are extremely simple, perhaps even optimal for computational systems. And from that optimal assumption, quite a range of interesting empirical conclusions follow. For example, we see that displacement, far from being a puzzling phenomenon, is in fact an expected property of a perfect language. Furthermore, optimal design yields the copy property of displacement with quite rich and complex semantic consequences. We have an immediate explanation for the very puzzling fact that language ignores simple properties of linear order and uniformly relies on the more complex property of structural distance. It's true of all languages and all constructions. And we also have an apparent explanation for the apparent fact that the diversity, complexity, and malleability of language are completely superficial phenomena. They apparently are localized almost entirely in an external system that's ancillary to the core mental phenomena of language and is a reflex of the sensory motor filter through which it has to be passed in order to be externalized. Well, if that's correct, we see that language is a system that's well designed for thought, in fact, maybe perfectly designed for thought, but poses problems for use, in particular for communication. To put it simply in terms which horrify psychologists, language is perfectly designed for thought. It's perfect for thought, impossible to use. Roughly true. We have plenty of evidence for that in experience, I think. So it's an instrument of thought, as in fact was classically assumed. Of course, when I say that language is designed for thought, design is obviously a metaphor. What it means is that the simplest imaginable evolutionary process yields linguistic systems with these properties. And the very limited evidence about human evolution suggests that the simplest evolutionary process may have taken place. It seems some reason to believe that all of this is the case to really establish the thesis powerfully. If it's correct, is a very large task, open one for the future, but I think quite a promising one.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm sure many of you will want to take up parts of that wonderful talk later. But Professor Chomsky asked if we could, for some time anyway, talk about the other big part of his intellectual life, the anarcho-syndicalism, etc., and your intellectual views. Before, as a link, do you see a connection between what you have been talking about now and the political views which we call anarcho-syndicalism?
I think one has to be cautious about that. There's no logical connection. Like one could believe what most psychologists, philosophers, and linguists believe, and which is quite different from this, and have the same political views. That would not be a logical contradiction, and conversely. Nevertheless, there's a kind of an underlying suggestive connection, which actually has historical origins. So there was a time, 18th century, when there were similar, basically at the time when classical liberalism emerged, late Enlightenment, Wilhelm von Humboldt, Adam Smith, Rousseau, to an extent, the early Marx. You put this together, there were ideas about the nature of language and the nature of appropriate social systems which were similar. they were based on the conception, goes back to Descartes was actually the first to formulate it clearly, not the social aspect, he was quite reactionary, but the basic idea that the essential property of humans, as distinct from other organisms, was a kind of creative capacity which manifested itself most clearly and centrally in language. So there's a kind of Descartes, his criterion for everyone knows that Descartes distinguished body and mind. His basic criterion for identifying mind was the ability to use language in the normal creative way. Creative in the sense that we all have the capacity to produce new expressions, new in our experience, new in the history of the language, and to do it in a way which is appropriate to situations, but not caused by situations. So the particular situation, say, that I'm in now, does not cause me to produce the next sentence I'll produce. I could decide to talk about the weather in Boston or something. It wouldn't be appropriate, but I could easily do it, have that capacity. So you can do this endlessly without limit. And it's true of all humans. You have a capacity for a creative activity not caused by external or internal circumstances, but appropriate to them in some way. That's a total mystery, I should say. It was a mystery in the 17th century. It's a mystery today. It goes beyond standard physical assumptions. Modern physics is based essentially on two principles, determinacy and randomness. Everything that can be accounted for is accounted for either as determinate or random. The same is true of general theory of computation. So those of you who know Turing machine theory, general theory of computation, know that it's either determinate or random. But apparently human intelligence goes beyond that, which is quite mysterious, but it's evident to all of us. We can act creatively in this way, new expressions, appropriate to situations, eliciting, not caused by them, eliciting thoughts in other people which are new to them but which they comprehend. So that's just normal human behavior, totally distinct from anything known in the animal world and not easy to explain in physical terms when you think it through. It's just as mysterious now as it was when it was pointed out in the 17th century. Now, what does this have to do with the way society ought to be organized? Well, the conclusion that was drawn by, say, by Rousseau, by Humboldt and others, is that any social system which inhibits human creativity is unacceptable. People should be free to inquire, to create, to realize their own potential, to develop their own creative capacities which are internal to them, without external imposition of authority or force or domination. Well, that's the core principle of classical anarchism. It's an outgrowth of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism ran aground on the rise of capitalism. The two are incompatible. Capitalist systems are incompatible with classical liberal ideas. And the residue that persisted is what led to the core of the modern anarchist tradition, sometimes called libertarian socialist tradition. That's the connection. It's not a logical, right? It's a connection of sort of, I don't know what, a spirit or something like that, which was discussed and articulated in the 18th century and has raises some interesting things to think about, including the nature of this creative capacity. What is it? And is it correct that a society that in some way limits, constrains, and controls it is illegitimate? Is it illegitimate to have social structures of any kind that involve authority, domination, hierarchy, coercion? Are these fundamentally illegitimate structures? If they're not, they have to justify themselves somehow. They have a burden of proof. They have to show that they're legitimate. Maybe that can sometimes be done, but that they have the burden of proof. Authority is not self-justifying. And it sort of is rooted in conceptions of human nature of this kind, which were discussed in interesting ways in the 17th and 18th century.
How did you yourself, how did your interest in anarchism begin?
It began in childhood. Actually, the first article that I wrote, that I can remember writing at least, was I can date it exactly, it was February 1939. It was about the fall of Barcelona, and it started by talking about the spread of fascism, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Toledo, Barcelona. Barcelona is the end of the anarchist revolution in Spain. Actually, it had ended earlier, but I didn't know that at the time. So it looked, and about at that time, I began to go hang around anarchist bookstores in New York. There were emigres, Spanish emigres fleeing from the residue of the revolution. Actually, as I say, I didn't know it at the time, but the revolution had already been destroyed 2 years earlier. It existed in 1936, but it was crushed by the combined efforts of fascists, communists, and liberal democracies. Now, they disagreed on all kind of other things, but they agreed that liberty cannot be tolerated. So it was quite successful, but it was crushed. This doesn't enter much into official history because, you know, the existing systems of power don't like to look at it that way. But I think you can see it. If you read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, he was in the kind of quasi-Trotskyist militia, POUM militia. So, and as he says, he didn't really understand what the anarchists were doing. He is very honest about that. But he says there was something good about it. He could sense that there was something important happening. And he describes how it was crushed, mainly by communists in May 1937, but with the collaboration of the liberal democracies and of course the fascists who were supporting Franco. I didn't know that at the time. But in fact, I didn't read Homage to Catalonia, though it was published already. And there was an interesting reason. It was suppressed. Orwell's British publishers would not permit it. I mean, I think they published a couple of dozen copies or something. It was essentially unknown. It was anti-communist, and that was just not tolerable in the climate of the time. So it only appeared years later as a kind of a Cold War document, anti-communist Cold War document, which I'm sure would have horrified Orwell. It was after his death. So I didn't know that book until much later. But there was a lot of material around, pamphlet literature, left journals, even talk with emigres, which kind of made all of this alive. Later I learned more about it.
You were already into your studies, but did this discovery of anarchy and the excitement that you felt, but did that lead you on a course to action, that you were determined to do something in the largest political arena possible, whether it was the streets or in writing pamphlets or however it was? Did that lead you to a course of action that you followed?
It did, but just personally, the main, this was right in the early days of the Second World War. And I was a young teenager, so not doing a lot of things politically, but there were there's a wide variety of activist political groups, but I was never able to join any of them because they were all, virtually all of the functioning ones were either kind of mainstream liberal, I wouldn't accept that, to the right, pro-fascist, and they existed, of course, all over, or the so-called left groups were almost entirely Bolshevik. And I was anti-Leninist, strongly anti-Leninist. I thought at the time that the Bolshevik Revolution was the worst disaster that had ever befallen the socialist movement. I still think that. So it was kind of closed off from direct political participation. And my own personal activism happened to be mostly connected with Palestine. I grew up in a as you mentioned, in a Jewish environment. My parents were politically kind of Roosevelt Democrats, though much of the family was unemployed Jewish working class, all kinds of political radicalism. I was very much involved in what was then the Zionist movement. It's now called anti-Zionist, efforts to create a binationalist, Arab-Jewish, working class-based socialist community in Palestine. It may sound exotic now. It wasn't so strange in the environment at the time. Something like that could have been possible. That was a large part of my own political activism up till 1948, when that ended for obvious reasons.
Can I just ask a couple more questions, because you yourself wanted to bring this in. Can you just say how your protest at the war in Vietnam played into your, how your views played into that?
Well, the 1950s were pretty quick. I should say in the early 40s, I was very strongly opposed to British imperialism. So one of the moments of, dramatic moments of my own early teenage life was the British invasion of Greece, which I thought was an utter horror story. I wrote about it, talked about it, and so on. But this went on through the 40s. You know what was happening in that period. The 1950s were a pretty quiescent time. Nothing much was happening. There was a lot, it's called McCarthyism, but it was much broader than that. There was a kind of a massive suppression of independent thought, independent action, very much like after the First World War. First World War, the labor movement in the United States was simply wiped out, revived in the 30s, but it was practically destroyed. In the early 50s, a huge assault began against labor. It's pretty well studied in scholarship, and people who lived through it are aware of it. But there was a massive attack to try to undermine the kind of, out of the Second World War came a kind of a radical democratic spirit around the world, all over, and in Europe and in the United States, everywhere. And the first task of the victors, the United States and Britain, was to crush it. In Europe, they had to crush the partisans. The first actions of the British and American armies were to crush the partisan movements, which were basically radical democratic, and that was intolerable. So, and this was incidentally under the British Labour Party. When the British forces moved up to northern Italy, British and American forces, they discovered a functioning society. The Italian partisans were a strong movement. They had essentially driven out the Nazis. The British and the Americans had to destroy them. They had developed a cooperative, functioning society. The British Labour Party was appalled at the fact that workers were managing their own firms without bosses telling them what to do. That was completely unacceptable. And the Americans, of course, even more so. So in Italy and Greece, similar things in France, even in Germany. One of the reasons for breaking Germany up into two sections, which is expressed by George Kennan, one of the leading architects of the post-war world, was that it was necessary to wall Western Germany away from the East. Interesting turn of phrase. The problem was that in the East there were radical labor-based movements developing, and the West had to be protected from that. So we had to wall it off from the Eastern influences. This went on all over Europe. And the same was happening at home. So massive assault on labor, and it was a pretty quiescent period. Getting to the Vietnam War, the right time to have become involved in it was early 1950s. And there was just no imaginable way to do it. By 1961, it was becoming much more serious. This is not the normal history, but if you look at the actual facts, when Kennedy came in, John F. Kennedy, in 1961, he very quickly escalated the war sharply. In 1961-62, authorized the U.S. Air Force to carry out bombing raids in South Vietnam. They did it under South Vietnamese markings. So the planes had South Vietnamese markings, but they were American planes piloted by Americans. The facts kind of dribbled through, but nobody was paying attention. He also authorized napalm, authorized chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, began programs to drive the peasants into what amounted to concentration camps called strategic hamlets, where they were surrounded by barbed wire to protect them from the guerrillas who they were supporting. Facts, we now know that this was understood from internal documents, but that was the kind of propaganda. It's pretty clear if you looked at it what was going on. So at that point it was possible to begin talking about the war, but in a very narrow way. I mean, the first talks that I was able to give were literally in people's living rooms or in a church with 4 people, the preacher, the organizer, a drunk who walked in, a guy who wanted to kill me. But that was a typical audience. And this went on for a long time. It's kind of suppressed now, but it's worth knowing. Those of you who are old enough to remember and participate may recall that there was an international day of protest against the war in October 1965. By that time, South Vietnam had been practically destroyed. North Vietnam was being bombed. There were hundreds of thousands of American troops there, so there was an international day of protest. I lived in Boston. Boston's maybe the most liberal city in the country, or close to it. We thought we would have an outdoor demonstration on the Boston Common. It's essentially Hyde Park, where everything takes place. So there was a march to the Boston Common. I was supposed to be one of the speakers. It was broken up by force, and mostly by students, violently broken up. The liberal press praised those who were breaking up the demonstrations. How dare these, unpatriotic people not support our noble troops, and so on and so forth. The next International Day of Protest was in March 1966, and we realized we couldn't have an outdoor demonstration, it'd be broken up. So it was in a church. Church was attacked, a lot of police around, couldn't do anything, and so on. It was only 67, 68 that you really began to get protest. And England, it was worse, incidentally. The person who was really running pretty much the international anti-war movement, and especially in England, was Peggy Duff, who some of you may recall, a wonderful person. She had to bring in speakers from the United States to give talks to demonstrations in England. I came a couple of times. I.F. Stone came a couple of times, and nobody wanted to say anything here, practically. And this went on for a long time, same elsewhere. I mean, there's all kind of illusions that have been created about it, but that's what, it was quite a while before things really took off.
Can I come in now, because an awful lot of people want to ask questions. We've got about 20 or 30 minutes. I think there are microphones, but people have got loud voices and I can repeat questions. So would you like to ask questions on the gentleman on the end, the left there? Anybody with their hand up, would you give them a microphone? Somebody with that, if you keep your hands up, somebody with their hand up.
Hello. Careers in science are usually officially narrated as success story after success story, whereas that's much less likely to be the case in politics. So I'd like to ask you what you think are the disappointments and possibly the failures of your career, both perhaps the study of language and in politics.
What are the disappointments? Well, in the study of the general domain of language and mind, say, language, cognitive science, so on, the main disappointment to me is the persistence of pretty much behaviorist attitudes, simple, descriptive behaviorist attitudes that were prevailing in the 1950s. I think had been intellectually destroyed, but by now are very prevalent. And they're coming back through the existence of rapid computation, what's called big data, statistical analysis. You can collect huge amounts of data, toss it into a computer, do a lot of statistical analysis, come out with meaningless results, but it looks like it's doing something. That's very tempting. It's taken over the fields to an extraordinary extent. The government's pouring tons of money into it, so are the corporations. Those of you who are anywhere near the brain sciences are aware that there's a huge project now, a government project in the United States to map the human brain, find out all the neuronal connections of those 10 to the 10th neurons, and somehow some kind of magic is going to come out of that. The chance that anything will come out of it is pretty slight. I mean, take, say, insects. Okay, much easier to study than humans. Like a bee, for example, has about 800,000 neurons. It's a brain the size of a grass seed. There's a couple hundred species, so you have a lot of comparative evidence. There's a gestation period of about 3 days, so you can grow them, raise them the way you like. You can do any kind of experiment you like. You don't have to have a consent form if you take a bee apart. So it's a perfect object of inquiry. Nobody understands how the bee's brain is doing these extremely complex computational tasks that humans can't perform. Bees can do all kinds of navigation that we can only do with instruments. How do they do it with this tiny little brain? Well, it's a very hard problem. It hasn't been solved. There are some of the leading scientists in the field, people like Rodolfo Linas, some of you might know at NYU, for years has been studying one neuron. There's a big neuron in the giant squid, and he's been studying that neuron to try to figure out how on earth does it distinguish between a predator and food, let's say. That turns out to be a very hard problem. I mentioned that there's a huge literature on what's called evolution of language. Take a look at the literature on evolution of bee communication, a vastly simpler topic, almost no literature, because scientists understand it's just too hard. Okay, getting back to the brain project, suppose you could map all the neuronal connections of these 10 to the 10th neurons. What would you know? Probably nothing, You may not even be looking at the right thing. There's all kinds of things going on in the brain apart from neuronal connections. Just getting a lot of data and statistics and so on in itself just doesn't tell you anything. I mean, that's been the fate of the genome project. There were lots of expectations at first, a lot of propaganda about how when you decoded the genome, we'd have wonderful cures for all kinds of diseases and so on. Well, it's a valuable project. Things have been learned, but the transition from a genome to an organism is extremely complex, and knowing the genome doesn't answer how it happens, how the cell works as a production system, let's say.
Can we go for some more questions? Because
so that's a disappointment. In the political domain, it's too easy to list. I don't think I have
there, gentlemen. Would anybody like to put their hand up, and somebody will bring a microphone to them?
Professor Chomsky, it's a real privilege to be able to hear you talk, and I'd just like to thank you for sort of shaping and continuing to shape the way that I view the world. My question relates to what you've written and spoken about quite extensively, the two dominant threats that are posed to humans' survival, climate change and nuclear war. I was just wondering to what extent you've considered a third possibility, which perhaps is maybe not quite so obvious, the threat of digital companies, companies mainly working in places like Silicon Valley, working quite secretively on stuff like the singularity theorem and the Internet of Things, which are purported to create a kind of super intelligence that will render humanity fairly obsolete. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that, and whether in fact it's a bad thing at all.
Well, so what about the development of supercomputers that will be more intelligent than humans, and singularity, you know, they'll take over everything and will be superfluous and so on. Actually, I've been listening to I've been at MIT for 60 years, since 1950, and I've been listening to this for 60 years. The line has always been, in 6 months, we will have computers which will do X, Y, and Z. We don't have them. There's a famous paper by Alan Turing called How to Make Machines Think, or some title like that. Short paper, 8 pages, around 1950. It's the basis for all of this work on what's called the Turing test, trying to develop machines which will think. You know, a machine that'll defeat a grandmaster in chess, you know, will win a prize in a television program and so on. All of this work, and you can win $100,000 if you develop what they call a machine. A machine means a program, it's not the machine. If you develop a program that will pass the so-called Turing test, you know, fool a human and fool a jury of humans into thinking it's a person, not a machine. All of this work overlooks a brief sentence in Turing's paper, namely, the questions whether machines think is too meaningless to deserve discussion. Okay? He didn't bother explaining it, but it's pretty obvious. I mean, you can develop what, again, it's kind of sexy to talk about a machine, but remember, a machine is just like, in itself, it's kind of like a paperweight, doesn't do anything. It's the program that's doing something. And the program is just some kind of theory, you know, complicated theory. So you can develop theories that will do specific tasks. Like it was obvious in 1950 that if you put enough time and energy into it, you could develop a program that would win a chess game against a grandmaster. How? By getting 100 grandmasters to sit around for years and years, figuring out what to do in all possible circumstances and so on and so forth, program it, and it'll do better than a grandmaster who has a half an hour to think of the next move. Okay, it's completely uninteresting. Intellectually, zero interest. It's good for IBM. They sell a lot of computers that way, but it has no intellectual interest. The same is true of winning in a quiz show. You know, you toss a lot of data into the machine, it'll do better than a person. But getting a machine to do a program, again, to do anything that's at all like the creative activities that every 4-year-old child can carry out, that's quite different. And I don't think we have any grasp even on how to go ahead to do that. So I think one can have a fair degree of skepticism about the PR on super intelligent machines and singularity and so on.
Is there a question? Who's got the microphone? Yeah, right. Will you stand up and ask a question, please?
In the land of the free, there's a great deal of intolerance as well. You're meant to be a patriot, for example. Patriotism is a very important quality. And you've been a sort of, not anti-American, but you've been sort of an outsider. You've been a critic of the United States. And many critics of the United States, within the United States, have suffered very badly in academic life, in the media, for example. And in fact, their careers have been destroyed. For some reason, you have survived all this. And I want to know how it is possible to live such an un-American life in the United States. I mean, how have you survived all this? Why have they allowed you to live?
Well, there are several reasons. There are plenty of criticisms to make of the United States, but it's a very free country, much more so than England, for example. Speech, for example, is protected in the United States to a degree that it's unheard of here. I mean, it's inconceivable in the United States that government forces would break into the offices of CBS, let's say, or the New York Times and take their computers and their programs. It happens here. Even the conception of protecting freedom of speech is very limited in the United States. So as I'm sure you know, here, I mean, so take, say, the British libel laws. They're a terrible constraint on freedom of speech, and they're used. I mean, they are used for, recently there was a case where one of the big television companies, was it ITV, is it, or ITN, I forget what it's called, was able to crush a small, tiny left newspaper because the newspaper published something criticizing, you know, maybe undermining some of their claims, and they didn't like it, so they sued them for libel. And in Britain, you can get away with that. And of course, a small newspaper with 4 people can't compete in a, you know, in a lawsuit with a huge corporation. And that was actually applauded by many journalists. I thought it was pretty appalling. But that kind of thing does happen in Britain, and in France it's worse. In France it's just incredible. The rest of Europe is not great. But in the United States it's protected, strongly protected. Not perfect, but to a degree that's, I think, unknown elsewhere. That's one reason. There is protection. My own university, say MIT, during the Vietnam War period, it was almost entirely funded by the Pentagon. It was also the main academic center of anti-war resistance, not protest. Tax resistance, draft resistance, the academic center of it was mostly right there at a university that was mostly Pentagon funded. And there was no real repression. The other reason is that this isn't as far out of the mainstream as you might think. It's out of the liberal intellectual mainstream, but that's not the country. Not the country at all. The country tends to be much more open and independent. So you can reach people all over the place, maybe not through the, you know, the mainstream journals, but, or even the intellectual journals, but they're there. So it's in no sense are you really isolated. I mean, there are times when it's isolated, like the early years of the Vietnam War, as I mentioned. They were facing real antagonism. You're living with death threats, you know, that sort of thing, but that's not usual.
A question back there, is it? Yes? Could you stand up? It helps us all. Thank you.
Could you just give us some of your thoughts on the current problems between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, let's distinguish Crimea from Ukraine. Right? The Russian takeover of Crimea was obviously in violation of international law. And when the West, you know, condemns the violation of international law, it's correct. But as usual, there are a few other things to think about. So yes, that's in violation of international law. It doesn't compare with what the US does with British support. So for example, take Eastern Cuba, okay? 100 years ago, 110 years ago, the US took over Eastern Cuba. It's what we call Guantanamo. Eastern Cuba by force. Cuba was invaded by the US forces. The guise was liberation. It was actually conquest. Cuba was compelled at gunpoint to hand over Eastern Cuba to the United States. When Cuba finally gained independence in 1959, it tried to get it back, but the US refused, holds on to it, uses it, as you know, as a torture chamber, as a place to confine people that don't know what to do with, and so on. It's also preventing the development of Cuba. It's one of the main reasons for keeping it. It contains Cuba's main port, which points towards Europe for trade. So the main purpose for the last 50 years has been essentially to impede the development of Cuba, part of the whole embargo system. That's much worse than the takeover of Crimea. I mean, Crimea, you can, you know, I don't think it's justifiable, but you can give some reasons for it. In the case of the takeover of eastern Cuba, the sole reason you can give is to undermine Cuban independence and development. Okay, so if you condemn the takeover of Ukraine, that's fine, I do, of Crimea, but then let's add that the takeover of eastern Cuba is much worse, okay? What about the Russians in Ukraine? That's a complicated story. In fact, there's an article in the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, a lead article, a couple of issues back, by John Mearsheimer, the leading international relations specialist. And notice that this is mainstream establishment I'm talking about, not on the left. The article is called "The West is Responsible for the Ukraine Crisis." And what Mearsheimer points out is that going back to roughly 1990, when the Russian Empire collapsed, there were questions about how should the post-war system develop. Gorbachev made a remarkable concession. He agreed to allow unified Germany, to join a Western military alliance. You think about history, that's pretty astonishing. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia a couple of times in the century. Now he was saying unified militarized Germany can join a hostile military alliance. There was a quid pro quo, a condition that NATO would not move, the phrase was, 1 inch to the east. That meant East Germany, okay? So NATO would not move to East Germany. That was the quid pro quo. NATO immediately moved to East Germany. Gorbachev was pretty upset, but he was informed by President Bush, Bush #1, and James Baker, Secretary of State, that this was just a verbal agreement. There was nothing on paper. And the implication, they didn't say it, but the implication is if you're dumb enough to accept a verbal gentleman's agreement with the United States, that's your problem. So NATO moved, he didn't say that, I'm adding it. NATO moved to East Germany. Clinton came in, NATO moved further towards the right, to the borders of Russia, all the way along. Actually, a question that we ought to be asking ourselves is why did NATO even exist after 1990? Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes, it's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a US-run intervention force. Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question, what was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global US intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we could go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.
At the back there, someone with their hand up there, a green sleeve is all I can see.
Can I ask what your thoughts are on what's going on in Ferguson, Missouri?
And what are your thoughts on what's going on in Ferguson, Missouri?
In Ferguson? Well, there are two kinds of questions. There's a narrow question of whether the grand jury decision was correct. To be honest, I don't think we can say. We just didn't see the evidence that was presented to them. So I don't think it's fair to say that the jury decision was wrong. Personally, I think it probably was, but I don't have the evidence. There's a broader question. Why are blacks being murdered by the police? And it's not just this case. I mean, it's case after case. The police are heavily militarized. The attacks on African-American males are way beyond any level of criminal behavior and so on. This extends to the so-called drug war. Blacks are specifically targeted by the drug war, from police action up through sentencing, through post-incarceration release. They are specifically targeted. Now, take a look at the history. The first slaves came to the United States in 1619, okay? It's 500 years. During this 500-year period, there have been maybe 3 decades when African Americans had some kind of a fair shot at joining the mainstream society. That's literally true. I can run through the details if you like. The current system doesn't have legal discrimination, but it has a whole array of social, political, other measures which maintain a system very much like Jim Crow, like the system that existed after the Civil War and right up to the Second World War, in fact. So that's the broader situation, and that's across the board, quite apart from the question of what the grand jury decided in this case. I think that's the background against which we have to think of it.
Is there another question? Somebody there, just in front of you.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. Thanks for coming. In an interview with the BBC you gave a couple of years ago, the journalist asked you about how you squared your pessimism with your optimism, and I believe you remain optimistic about social change and all that it can bring. But do you remain optimistic now, all these years later? And if so, why? Can you give some examples so that it alleviates some of my pessimism about society?
Well, you know, there's a famous line of Gramsci's, but wasn't original to him, but he made it famous. We should have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And I think that's a good formula. With regard to pessimism, we have 2 choices. We can say, look, everything's hopeless, so let's quit, and we'll help ensure that the worst will happen. Or we'll say, look, there are possibilities, let's pursue them, maybe things will get a little better. That's not a real choice. And that's all there is to say. I mean, for every one of these major problems, there are possible solutions. And there's, in many respects, our societies are considerably more civilized than they were, say, 50 years ago. Many respects. So, for example, the most striking example is women's rights. That's just changed enormously in the last 50 or 60 years in much of the world, in the West in particular. All sorts of cases. I mean, take the United States. In the United States, women, go back to the early days of American history, the founding fathers took over British common law, of course. Under British common law, women were not persons, they were property. A woman was the property of her father, transmitted to her husband. Over the years, that changed, but slowly. It wasn't until 1975 in the United States that women had a legal, a guaranteed right to serve as peers in federal juries. Peers means equal persons. That's just a few years ago. That's one of many changes. Take, say, opposition to aggression. It's much higher than it was back in the early 60s. What I described in the early 60s, it could not take place now. So you compare, say, the invasion of Vietnam with the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was the first time in the history of Western imperialism when you had huge protests before the invasion was officially declared. I mean, it had been going on, but before it was officially declared, there were huge protests. That's totally different from what happened in the invasion of South Vietnam, okay? And it had an effect. I mean, what happened in Iraq was bad enough, but Bush and Blair never dreamed of carrying out the kinds of actions that Kennedy and Johnson carried out with impunity. All right, those are changes. Take nuclear weapons. There now is very widespread popular opposition to development of nuclear weapons. It's still going on, and the threat of nuclear war, I think, is severe, much more than people imagine. But it's been lessened, and there's popular opposition which could grow. In the case of the major issue we face, environmental catastrophe, that was not even considered a problem 40 years ago. And now it's understood to be a problem, and there's plenty of popular activism, even not enough, but plenty doing something about it. These and many other things are signs of, there are other signs of, for reasons for optimism. Take, say, Latin America. Okay, for 500 years since the conquistadors, Latin America was dominated by foreign powers. The last century or so, the United States. And internally, virtually every Latin American country was run by a small, wealthy, Europeanized, often white elite in the midst of enormous poverty and suffering in basically potentially pretty rich societies. The last 10 or 15 years, that's changed. There's a reason why Assange is in the Ecuadorian embassy. Latin America has become significantly free of external control, more so than almost any other part of the world. And it's beginning to face some of its horrible internal problems. Now, those are all signs of optimism. It means there are things that can be done.
I think it's getting towards the end. There's an urgent question, and you might want to summarize with a few words. One more question? Behind you there, blue shirt there.
Given that the Western democracies have been evacuated of any meaning and the plutocracy is what we have, I just wonder, do you vote in general elections in America, or would you advise somebody in UK to go and vote next year in general elections?
My feeling is that it's a decision, but it's the kind of decision that's kind of 10th order. I think it should be made in 5 minutes. Sometimes there's a point in voting, like it could be, there's worse and less worse. Okay, it might make a difference. And I sometimes vote. Sometimes I voted for Republicans because they were better, not in presidential elections. But most of the time, it's a very small decision. Maybe if you can, you just have to compare the alternatives and see if there's on balance any difference. But it doesn't seem to me a fundamental question. The real problem is what to do about the fact that we don't live in political democracies. That's the real problem. So take the United States, which I know better and has been studied more intensively. In the United States, it is literal. You can read in academic political science, not on the left, that about 70% of the population, lowest 70% on the income scale, is entirely disenfranchised, meaning their opinions have zero impact on policy, even their own representatives. They're simply ignored. One of the reasons why they don't vote, they may not read the scientific journals, but they know it in their lives. as you move up the income scale, you can start getting a little more influence, as measured by the relation between attitudes and policy. Okay? When you get to the very top, which is a fraction of 1%, policy is made. Okay? What kind of a system is that? I mean, does it matter if you pick one or another representative? Sometimes it does, at kind of way out at the margin. But the real problem is the nature of the system. I don't think England is that much different.
Okay, would you like to say anything in conclusion, or shall we call a halt to it now? Well, if you'd like to have a concluding statement, I'm sure we'd all like to hear it, and then that would be the end of the meeting.
I'd rather hear it. My kids, children ask questions all the time, and my kids used to have a line when they would ask me a question, and they would say, "Please, just the 5-minute lecture."
Thank you very much for more than that this evening, and I know we'll all want to thank Professor Chomsky now.